Fully human and fully divine means that Jesus of Nazareth wasn't just a great guy, an inspiring teacher, and a holy person. He was God. In response to Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" on the way to Caesarea Philippi, Peter finally answers correctly, "You are the Messiah." And here's something I learned from Dan Harrington just as I was writing this book. But the Messiah at the time did not encompass the idea of divinity, right? When they talked about the Messiah, the person who would kind of restore Israel's fortunes, right, and bring about this change, it didn't encompass the idea of divinity. Jesus is divine, much more than Peter's response and confession can encompass. Jesus performs astonishing deeds, what the gospel writers call works of power, or in the Gospel of John, signs. Today we call them miracles. Healing the sick, calming storms, raising people from the dead. Time and time again, the Gospels report that Jesus' followers, no matter how long they've been with him, are, quote, amazed or astonished. One of my favorite lines after Jesus heals a paralyzed man in the Gospel of Mark is, "We have never seen anything like this." I want to say, no kidding. You know? Even his detractors took note of his miracles. The question in the Gospels is not whether Jesus does miracles, it's where his power comes from, right? And why he's doing them on the Sabbath. The miracles are an essential part of the story of Jesus, as are other signs of his divinity. So is the resurrection. If Jesus' humanity is a stumbling block for people, his divinity is even more so. For a rational modern mind, talk of the supernatural is disturbing, an embarrassment even. I'm sure you know people who maybe even people in this audience who admire Jesus and say he's so compassionate and I follow the Beatitudes, but all that stuff about like raising people from the dead and healing people and walking on water and the resurrection, I don't know about that. They stop short of believing him to be fully divine. Despite the proportion of the Gospels that focus on his works of power, in fact, some of the sayings that we take for granted, you know, and say, obviously Jesus said that, are in the context of healing stories. Despite all that, many want to confine his identity to that of just a wise teacher. Thomas Jefferson went so far as to create his own gospel by focusing on Jesus' ethical teachings and literally scissoring out the stuff he didn't like, right? Jefferson, like many of us, preferred his own version of Jesus, not the one in the Gospels. Like many of us, he felt uncomfortable with some parts of the Gospels. He wanted a Jesus who didn't threaten or discomfort him. He wanted a Jesus he could tame, basically. But you can't tame Jesus. In fact, the scripture scholar E.P. Sanders wrote a book called The Historical Figure of Jesus. And he did a study. He figured, well, I'm going to read Thomas Jefferson's gospel and see who Jesus is for Thomas Jefferson. And he realized it was like this wise, knowledgeable person. And he said Jesus was basically Thomas Jefferson, you know? You know, I asked Dan Harrington, to whom this book is dedicated once, he said that people who focus solely on the historical figure of Jesus, which is very important, I'll talk about that in a little bit, solely on the historical figure, often find themselves, you know, they look into the mirror and they see themselves, basically. So Jesus is the social activist, Jesus is the prophet, those kinds of things. And at the time, the Jesus Seminar was very popular, all right? This is back in the 90s. And I said to Dan, well, what is the Jesus of the Jesus Seminar? And Dan said, Jesus, the professor of religious studies. That's a quote. Both humanity and divinity are part of Jesus' story. Omit one or another, scissor out the uncomfortable parts, and it's not Jesus we're talking about, it's our own creation.